Okay, so this video is going to be about global imperialism between about 1870 and the start of World War I in 1914, and the implications of the European nations in particular, taking over and conquering parts of Africa and Asia, and the usage of these areas as colonies, and the ultimate subjugation of the peoples of these areas as well. So we know that as part of the Industrial Revolution now, these industrialized European nations had become extremely successful, especially economically, right? And they ultimately wanted to increase this economic success in really any ways that they possibly could, right? So in order to do that, in order to continue the endless demands of capitalistic societies here, they are going to need to expand two different things to continue to expand their own economies. And one of these is the inclusion and trying to find more natural resources to fuel their factories and the industrial output. But then also, once they have created these new goods in their factories, they're also going to need markets to be able to sell these particular goods in these areas of the world. So one means in attempting to continue to expand their economies, the way we were just talking about, is through what is known as imperialism. And imperialism is the practice of one country essentially extending its control over another country in one of three different methods, one of three different ways. So the first is controlling the territory of another country directly. Another can be controlling the economy of another country, or you are controlling the political system of one another. And through imperialism, you don't necessarily have all three of these, but when you do manage to gain control of all three of these different aspects of a particular country, obviously you have more or less what's called direct control of these areas of the world. And you're going to be seeing this type of direct control all over the place during this imperialism era. As part of this imperialistic era, the European nations are going to see an opportunity in areas of the world, in particular in Africa and Asia, which were areas significantly less industrial developed, right? And as a result, they were significantly weaker than these European countries. So the reason why these European nations are now going to compete with one another for these particular areas, as we were saying just a second ago, it's to obtain increases in natural resources and accesses to certain natural resources they may not have in the motherland, or just additional resources they may not have in their parent country, right? And then you also then have the markets that come along with it, right? If, say, there's 1 million people in this area or this country that you are taking over, you could then potentially sell the goods that you create back to those people in those markets, right? Imperialism also is a means of securing economic and political success for a particular country, right? If you are able to gain control of these areas, it looks good, I suppose, to the people of your country who is doing it. And as a result, it's going to feed into this idea of nationalism, right? This proud loyalty and devotion to your country. And what's going to happen is these people in these European countries, as they are going to be imperializing these other areas of the world, they are going to see this as a sense of pride, and they are going to look at it fondly as a means of trying to Christianize and westernize these less civilized areas of the world, and that's going to kind of lead to things like mission work, increased mission work in areas, in particular in Africa in the 19th century. So imperialism does essentially spread economic, political, social, and religious philosophies of Europe throughout the world as a result. I like to use this map of Africa to kind of talk about this unit a little bit, because I think one thing that is often lost in translation sometimes is just how large Africa actually is. So when you look at this map in comparison, you can see that the continent of Africa actually swallows up what would be all of the United States, most of Europe, India, China, Japan, and such as well, right? Africa is an enormous area, and it's going to be extremely difficult for these European countries to originally penetrate the continent, and it's going to be now the technological advances that occur during the Industrial Revolution that are going to make this significantly easier for the European countries to be able to do, and as a result, make it possible for it to happen in the first place. Here you can see a political cartoon depicting what is known as the Berlin Conference that took place in 1884, when many of these European powers kind of came together to discuss how they are going to divvy up Africa. And you can see kind of right there, you have this cake where Afrique on it, and you can, what seems to be Otto von Bismarck there, kind of divvying it up, and people are kind of choosing their slices. Keep in mind also that this is during kind of the heyday of the British Empire, right? And where the British Empire is arguably at its strongest at this point. So this is another political cartoon that's kind of trying to emphasize that and show that, right? You have England there in the center with all of these different arms, kind of reaching out to all of these different areas of the world. You have Egypt, India, Canada, some areas of the Caribbean and such, right? So they're trying to kind of talk about and show that England kind of has its arms kind of everywhere, right? And that's going to be one of the reasons why you get the saying, the sun never sets on the British Empire, because of all of the different areas that England will have colonized during this time period and previously. So there are really kind of three forms of imperialism. The first is a colony, right? Colonies are a country or area that has been kind of taken control of by another country. It's going to be ruled by that country as a result, right? This is what I was talking about before with this kind of idea of direct control over a particular area. So you also have what are called protectorates, and these are an area or a country that is controlled by the more powerful country, but it's kind of more of a protection deal. They might act kind of independently in certain cases. However, the interests of your parent country are there for sure, and if something were to happen to them, the parent country is going to kind of get involved. And then you have this idea, lastly, of spheres of influence, right? It's an area of the world that is dominated by a certain country, but at the end of the day, they might not have that direct control over it, right? It's kind of a little too far out from the administrative center of the colony. It gets a little too far into the woods or the deep end or whatever you want to call it, right? And as a result, they're just not able to exert the same influence that they can when they are close, right? So ultimately, imperialism in Africa and Asia is going to be a pretty serious thing during this time, right? We know that the Europeans are going to dominate Africa and Asia through much of the 19th and early 20th centuries with their creation of the colonies, and the implementation and administration of these colonies are going to have rippling effects throughout history and throughout the time basically between this and even now today. So as I was kind of saying before about Africa and the difficulty in kind of taking control of this continent, Africa is a hostile place. You have native populations that are difficult to kind of subdue. You have issues kind of getting into the interior of the continent because of how large it is in the first place, but you also have hostile diseases, right? You have things like malaria and yellow fever that make it really difficult for Europeans to get access to these areas, and you're going to now have the technologies that are going to be opening up this imperialism, right? So for one, the Maxim gun, the machine gun, if you will, where they're going to be able to come in with a relatively small force and be able to basically just devastate African armies that are going to be kind of trying to stop the colonization and trying to protect their own sovereignty and their own free will, right? You're going to get the implementation of the railroad, right? The railroad is going to be able to make it easier to supply into the interior of the continent once it is created. And it is difficult to get it going, but once it has been established, it allows it to be just done much more effectively and efficiently. And you are also going to have the creation of what's called quinine. And quinine is this essentially drug that is going to be able to prevent mosquito-borne illnesses, right? That mosquitoes that had carried diseases like malaria, it's going to kind of stop this and stop the rates of infection against the Europeans who didn't have natural immunities to the disease. And as a result, these Europeans are going to be able to spend much longer time frames in these areas of the world. And that is going to allow the Europeans to kind of get the foothold into Africa and then eventually be able to subdue the native populations and to implement their own colonization practices. Here you can see a map of Africa around 1880, and prior to this, Africa was seen mostly as a source for the slave trade. So when the slave trade begins to be outlawed around the world and slave trade is going to continue to decline throughout this time period, these areas now are going to not be seen as all that useful for a little while here, right? Because of the issues getting in and remaining in the continent and penetrating the continent, these areas are kind of ended up being protectorates. There's no reason to fully subdue and take control of these areas because there's just, what's the point, right? So now you can see the difference that just 30 or so years make, right? With the creation of these new technologies we just talked about and the Europeans kind of deciding to divvy up Africa at the Berlin Conference, Africa is now going to be quickly divided amongst the industrial powers of Europe. It's not only going to take 30 years to essentially conquer the continent, and you can see you're going to get France kind of in the northwest of Africa. You're going to have United Kingdom, Great Britain and England, essentially kind of taking large swaths in the north, east, and the south. You're going to have Portugal getting involved, Spain getting involved, Italy, Germany, Belgium, you name it, right? Many of these European countries are all kind of trying to claim their own slice of the pie because they see the benefits of colonization for their own industrial societies, right? One thing to note is that Ethiopia is going to be one of the only places in Africa that's going to actually be able to remain independent and not fall to the European influence. With that map showing kind of just Africa, it's important to also show worldwide imperialism circa kind of 1914 of all over the world, right? So the United States is going to be getting involved itself. They're going to be taking colonies in the Caribbean and ultimately in the Philippines and in the Pacific as well. You're going to see the influence of the United Kingdom in India and Southeast Asia, right? And you're going to see France there also in Southeast Asia, what amounts to kind of modern day Vietnam. Right, so there is quite a bit of influence going around, just not even just in Africa, but outside of it. Right, every one of these Western powers are all seeing benefits to colonization. They don't want to get left behind. They don't want to become, I guess, less than the other European countries. They don't want them to get so much stronger that if a war were to break out or something, that they couldn't kind of handle it. So they all want their own piece of the pie. Another important thing that's going to kind of allow it to be just come a little easier to get into other areas of the world is the creation of what's known as the Suez Canal, which is going to be essentially a man-made river that's dug out between the Mediterranean Sea and the areas in the Red Sea, so that ships can actually travel through this without having to travel all the way around Africa. And that's a pretty big deal because you can see the difference in the amount of time and distance that it would take to go around versus being able to now go through this newly established Suez Canal, right? It's going to reduce the distance to India in particular by about 43%. That's pretty massive, and it's going to allow a much more efficient means of travel between these parent countries in Europe and the East. And that now more direct route from Europe to the East is going to allow for more efficient direct control in parts of Asia, right? So here in this map, you can see England in particular gaining direct control in India, right? And then the spheres of influence expanding beyond that from Nepal to Tibet. You have France, who is going to be getting control in Southeast Asia, in what becomes known as French Indochina, which is where modern-day Vietnam is. You're also going to see some British influence there, basically on Nanjing and Shanghai and all up and down the river. and you're going to see incursions by Russia down into the Mongolian steppes and also into Manchuria, where you are also going to get some German influence and also Japanese influence, right? Japan is going to end up colonizing for themselves, right? Once you have the opening up of Japan to the West in the late 1860s by the United States and them kind of stopping their own isolationism, they are going to kind of rapidly industrialize and begin their own incursions into Asia, trying to join essentially the colonization club, if you will. I think it is important to talk about resistance to the European imperialism too, right? This isn't just something that these areas are going to roll over and allow happen. Sadly for them, it really just is very difficult to do anything about it, but they are going to mount resistances wherever they can in a lot of places, right? So some of these resistances are going to take a few different forms, right? You're going to have intellectual movements that arise. So you're going to have nationalistic movements in the colonies themselves. And a good example of this would be the first Indian Nationalist Party being founded in the mid-1800s. You are going to be getting armed conflict now as well. China is going to have a war, actually a series of wars with England over the opium trade. England had basically been flooding China with opium as a means of kind of trying to subdue the country, but also kind of continue to have their foothold. And the Chinese are very upset by this, and they're going to kind of fight some wars that don't go particularly well. You're going to then have a chain of events and a series of events of the West kind of subduing China until the point where you get what's known as the Boxer Rebellion, where the Chinese once again are going to kind of try to rebel against their Western influence. They do not want the West there. However, the Western powers in the area are actually going to all team up with each other to kind of subdue this Boxer Rebellion in China around 1900, and it's going to kind of set the stage now for a subdued China all the way through into past World War II. So you're also going to get what's known as the Sepoy Rebellion in India, where you have a group of these soldiers that are going to effectively rebel as a result of them being forced to use cartridges for their rifles that were greased with cow fat. And the cow being a sacred animal in India, this is a bit of a problem for them and their Hindu beliefs, and as a result, they are going to fight over it, and it doesn't go, again, particularly well for the Indians. However, they are going to kind of give it their best shot, and the British will kind of subdue India now, really all the way through the end of World War I and World War II. And we need to talk about Japan a little more too, right? Japan was an island country. They had adopted a policy of no one in and no one out, this extreme isolationism, pretty much at one of the worst possible times in human history to do something like that, right? This policy is going to be implemented sometime around 1600 or so, and then from there, they're not going to be opened up to the West until about 1853, right? And think about all of the advancement that's going to happen in philosophical thought and technologies. It's going to be a serious eye-opening experience for the Japanese when a United States Commodore named Matthew Perry kind of shows up in Tokyo Bay with essentially modern, metal warships and modern cannonry, and it's going to kind of lead to this internal fighting in Japan, and that's going to establish what's known as the Meiji Restoration and the restoration of the emperor over the Tokugawa shogunate. And with this now, and the Meiji Restoration is going to essentially send out feelers and people out into the West to kind of learn what they'd missed, and then they would come back and, as a result, are going to rapidly industrialize and modernize Japan in an attempt to kind of become one of the boys on some level. They're trying to make themselves like the Western powers, so they will be recognized as an equal, and that's going to be one of the reasons why they are going to be forcing and trying to have their own colonies on mainland Asia. The Japanese are going to see themselves as this kind of superior Asian race, and they wanted to push their Japanese beliefs onto the other Asian nations as well. So that is it for this video, and until next time.